Chapter 4. CT. To begin with, Murph was relieved to find that everything inside the classroom looked more or less normal. 2 teachers were standing at the front of a class of kids, all noisily settling into chairs and dumping their bags under desks. One was the chiseled-chinned teacher he'd met at the school gates. He greeted Murph with a very hearty, "Good morning to our new arrival," and began moving towards him, holding out an upraised palm as if introducing a minor celebrity. Mary looked impressed. "How do you know Mr. Superman?" she asked Murph. "Mr. Super what?" Mary shot him another one of her looks. She did looks. "Boy, you really are new, aren't you? Mr. Superman's the head teacher. I'll save you a seat." She whisked off. It was becoming apparent to Murph that Mary was taking him under her wing, even though she didn't have any wings. Murph grinned up at the head in a bemused manner. "Morning, Mr. Superman. Ready to get started with that flying?" he beamed. Murph nodded politely back at the big, friendly face, although midway through the second nod, his eyes widened slightly as a thought occurred to him. He glanced over at Mary. Flying? His brief thought was rudely interrupted. "Right then," Mr. Superman said, striding to the door. "Mr. Flash will get you going." "Mr. Flash," thought Murph again, as he scuffed his sneakers over to the desk next to Mary and sat down. Sounds more like something you scrub the bath with than a teacher. Like the head, Mr. Flash seemed to have been spending some time in the gym, like weeks at a time. His upper arms bulged as if his shirt sleeves had been stuffed with joints of roast pork. His head was bald and extremely shiny, and his mouth was almost entirely obscured by a droopy ginger moustache. He was wearing army trousers tucked into tall black boots. As the pre-lesson faffage continued, he raised his chin so that he was looking down his nose at everyone. "Shut up, then!" he barked. Gradually, the shuffling and chatting came to a stop, and the class regarded him in silence. His left muscle seemed to ripple slightly of its own accord. He abruptly turned his back and began to scribble on an old-fashioned blackboard, talking as he did so. "My name, for the benefit of our new arrival," he said, squeaking the chalk with a noise like a gerbil being squashed, "is Mr. Flash. And welcome, squeak, squeak, to your first lesson today." The list of things that confused Murph about his new school was growing all the time. He could now add the fact that they still had blackboards, as if it was the 20th century. But the list was about to get much, much longer. Meanwhile, "Every story," declared Nectar, "needs a villain." He attempted a dastardly laugh, but it came out a little too high-pitched, so he quickly turned it into a cough. Nectar was dressed completely in yellow and black. His boots were bright yellow, his trousers jet black. Above a yellow belt, he was sporting a black shirt topped with a yellow waistcoat. His head was almost completely covered by a black helmet with bulging yellow eyepieces and topped with 2 quivering antennae. Basically, if you're not getting the picture yet, he had really gone for a theme. He was in a mean mood. Wasps usually are. Anyway, more about him in a minute. Don't forget him, will you? The big guy who's half wasp. Right, back to Murph. 40 minutes into Mr. Flash's lesson, Murph sat at the back of the class, feeling as though his brain had been removed, played with by a kitten for 10 minutes, then gently replaced. He sat with his mouth open and his brow furrowed like a small ploughed face field, trying desperately to work out what was going on. At his previous schools, lessons had had names like literacy, maths, or PE. Mr. Flash's lesson was called CT. But for the life of him, Murph couldn't work out what it stood for. At first, he went through the obvious options, like computer technology, but there were no computers involved. Then, as things got odder, he wildly thought that it could stand for anything. Cheese toppling, cat tickling, clown trolling. As far as Murph could work out, it seemed to be some sort of bizarre role-playing exercise, and he could only assume he'd missed something vital in the first few weeks of term. But he'd missed school before, and usually had no problems catching up with the odd times table or creative writing assignment about what he'd done over Easter. This lesson made him feel like he'd been to space for Easter and landed on a totally different planet. It started off with a boy with red hair and cheeks, standing up in front of the class and striking a pose with his hands on his hips. Mr. Flash looked at him approvingly. Clearly, this guy was a star student.
Right, Timothy,
beamed Mr. Flash.
Let's see how you're progressing, shall we?
Timothy began to strain, as if he was trying very hard, but failing to go to the toilet. Beads of sweat broke out on his oversized forehead, his ruddy cheeks becoming maroon. Mr. Flash gestured towards an old-fashioned grey TV set that was standing in the corner of the room.
Concentrate now, Timothy,
he growled.
Focus on the impact point.
Impact point, Murph mouthed, turning to Mary and giving her a quizzical stare. He'd expected her to look as baffled as him, but instead she gave him another cool raise of those eyebrows and a jerk of her head in the direction of Timothy. But before Murph could turn back, there was a loud fizzing noise and a sharp flash of light. When he did look forward, there was a thin stream of smoke rising from the back of the old TV, and Timothy, who was now almost entirely beetroot-coloured, was looking rather pleased with himself.
Well, it's a start,
said Mr. Flash.
Well done, but please do continue to use the remote when you're at home for the time being. We don't want another letter from your parents, do we?
Some of Timothy's friends in the front row giggled at this, and one of them cuffed him on the shoulder as he sat down as if to say, nice one. Murph wondered what he'd just missed. Clearly the red-faced boy had done something to the TV, but how? And what? And why wasn't he in trouble? Murph had once hit a TV at his old school with a badly aimed plimsoll that he'd been trying to throw to a friend, and he didn't get a well done. In fact, he'd had to go round and polish all the other TVs to say sorry. But there was no time to ponder this further. Mr. Flash was ordering someone else to the front of the class. It was the girl who'd been sitting on the other side of Mary. She had long, dark hair with green ends that straggled over her face. Her jumper was baggy and her jeans were ripped. Mr. Flash didn't look quite as enthusiastic this time.
Right. Morning, Nellie,
he said in a resigned tone of voice. Nellie didn't speak. She stood at the front of the class, staring at the ground and shuffling her dirty white sneakers.
Tell us about your cape then, Nellie,
coaxed Mr. Flash. She's not wearing a cape, thought Murph. Actually, Nellie was dressed like all her usual clothes were in the wash. She didn't respond to Mr. Flash's question. Murph thought he heard her let out a small squeak, but it was hard to tell, because at that moment there was a rumble of thunder from outside. A sudden gust of wind opened one of the windows and sent a pile of paper flying. Mr. Flash marched over and slammed the window closed.
Very nice, Nellie, thank you,
he said. She gets thanked for looking at her toes and not saying anything. This was even weirder than that time at Murph's previous school when Gavin Honeybun had brought in his mum's old mop for show and tell and pretended it was a horse.
Great cape from Timothy this morning, I think you'll all agree,
Mr. Flash was saying.
Progressing very nicely indeed. Nellie? Well, she gave it a try, didn't she? Now, what about hearing from the newest member of the class? Murph, is it?
Murph shuddered into action like an old tractor. His legs lifted him into an upright position, even though he didn't recall asking them to extend. Before he knew what was going on, he was facing the class, who were looking at him expectantly. Everyone except Nellie, who was still staring at the floor.
Now mind the fans,
cautioned Mr. Flash, pointing up to the ceiling, where a couple of plastic fans were rotating slowly.
Don't want sliced boy, do we?
He winked at Murph. Murph stared back at him blankly. Mr. Flash might as well have been speaking French. A horrible suspicion was growing at the back of Murph's mind like unwanted mushrooms. A suspicion that he was very much at the wrong school. He had no idea what he was expected to do. In fact, he was half expecting to wake up and discover that the whole thing had been a weird dream brought on by a huge cheese overdose the night before. Murph loves midnight cheesery.
Clear a space,
warned Mr. Flash, and the front row scraped their chairs backwards, looking excited.
Come on then, Mr. Cooper. Show us your cape. We haven't got all day.
Why do people keep saying cape? Thought Murph. Was this some kind of mime workshop? Would he have to pretend to be a flower growing from a seed next? He was just about to have a stab at miming wearing a cape, which we'd all have loved to have seen, but unfortunately, that very second, the bell rang for morning break.
Ah, saved by the bell, eh?
Said Mr. Flash, looking at Murph with one eyebrow raised.
Well, you'll be first up in CT tomorrow, so don't think you're off the hook. Maybe get some practice in tonight, eh? In secret, of course. I'm sure you know the rules.
By now, the class were grabbing their bags and heading for the door. Murph turned on his heel and went with them, with his brain fizzing like the still smoking TV in the corner.